Good morning. Well, I had hoped to do this talk without the glasses, but I was taking way too many notes during the early sessions, and I was certainly reminded during those sessions that this is a very different situation for me. Normally, I'm in the room to be the guy who understands the cloud. And obviously, today, I'm surrounded by people who understand the cloud, except that we all disagree. And so, while I'm often told that my role is, to be a cloud computing evangelist, I usually correct people and say, no, evangelists go into a room of people who already agree with them and make them feel good about it. I'm more of a missionary because I go into a room full of people who may have heard of me but may be deeply suspicious of my motives and get them at least interested in having a further conversation. Today's more like being in the College of Cardinals and we're trying to elect a pope. Because we all obviously agree on many more things than we disagree. And yet there's still some very significant points of controversy, and I hope that the sessions we're going to be in this afternoon and tomorrow will illuminate more than they merely create smoke and heat. If I can have my first chart up, please. I know that we reviewed these charts yesterday, so I know they're in there. Oh, I see. Okay, it was just there waiting for me to bring it down. It was indeed. There's a story I'd like to share about this title. I've been using that graphic of the intersection of CEO needs and CIO mandates for some time, but when I first developed it, the first word under CEO needs was innovative. And when I used this chart with a meeting of our CIO Advisory Council Board, they wouldn't let me move forward until I changed that word. They said, I'm not being asked to innovate. Maybe 3 years ago, I was being asked to be an innovator. Now my CEO wants to hear what I'm doing for the business, how I'm operationally bringing advantage straight to the bottom line. They demanded that I change that word. And I've advised our sales teams, make sure that when you talk to a CEO, you're talking about the thing he actually or she actually wants to be judged as bringing to the company and not what you imagine it to be. And I think the need for operational advantage is probably too often left to the side of cloud computing discussions. People say things like, well, you're not going to do this in the cloud, you are going to do this in the cloud, you won't put your bank in the cloud, you will put your photos in the cloud. And my feeling is, if you want to know where the cloud is going, look for where people are finding competitive advantage. And our previous speaker from Amazon used the phrase differentiated value creation as opposed to undifferentiated heavy lifting. If people say, well, you won't see a big bank move to the cloud, my feeling is that maybe what you will see instead is a lot of smaller banks. Because now I can be a bank that's focused on a particular industry or focused on a particular region and yet still enjoy the economies of scale in my processing and my record keeping that I previously needed to be a big general purpose and possibly quite mediocre financial institution to enjoy. So I would urge all of us to say, not how does the cloud solve the problems we have today, but given the availability of cloud resources and cloud models, how might we reconceive what the problems ought to be that get our attention? Geir Ramlath at Bechtel looked at the problems and said, I'm going to benchmark my internal costs against what people get these things done for. We heard a general statement earlier, and in fact, I guess 2 speakers have talked about 2 order of magnitude improvement. Here are some specifics. The CIO at Bechtel, not a vendor, but a CIO went out and said, what does it cost me to store data, to move data across the network, to administer a room full of servers, to manage a portfolio of applications? And if you find that you could maybe save 30 or 40%, you'd be interested. And if you found that you could save 50 or 60%, you'd be excited. He found 98% cost reduction opportunities. He found 40-to-1 ratios across the board for the major cloud providers. And I believe that this is the kind of thing that's utterly compelling to people and leads him, in fact, to say to his fellow CIOs, if you do not aggressively evaluate and adopt these techniques, at least internally, and quite possibly with the superior economics of using massively shared public resources, then your unreasonably high IT costs will become an impediment to your company's ability to compete in the marketplace of the coming years. That said, it's extraordinary to realize how many different types of service can be offered. And you've heard this 3-tier composition before. Amazon, to horrendously oversimplify, we're talking essentially servers as a service, which is not in any way to minimize the quality of the engineering they're doing in the problem of massively scalable databases and other things. But there's a notion of explicit management of capacity as part of what the customer does. You spin up additional virtual servers, and that's great. For some types of application, that's extremely relevant. our approach is quite different. We went in completely from the top down, from the function downwards instead of from the model of the infrastructure upwards. And so we don't expose anything at all that looks like a virtual server. There is no invocation of additional capacity by our customers. They simply turn the tap open more if they want more water. They don't call the waterworks and say, bring up another pump. And so we view this in terms of a much more abstract family of things like workflows and user interface rendering environments. And there's nothing that really looks like your conventional software development environment unless you choose to make it work that way. We're still waiting to see what the Microsoft model with Azure is going to be. So far, they're mainly pitching it as a seamless transition of your familiar development processes into the cloud, and I have a problem with that on 2 points. First of all, John Reimer at Forrester has said, no, it's not. That you can't move the semantics of applications that have a PC and can maintain permanent state on that machine up into the cloud where resources are released when you're not using them. And so you are going to have to think of this as, and this is his phrase, a new platform not suitable for porting existing .NET applications. So that's a pretty important caveat right there. But my second question is, if you could, why would you want to? Why would you want to preserve lovingly and with high fidelity a software development process that takes too long, is too complex, and doesn't deliver applications that evolve as rapidly as the problems that they're supposed to be solving? Why wouldn't you say, given the availability of cloud resources, why wouldn't I look at a different way of approaching the application development process? This is an important idea to get across. I'm going to take exception to what Paul said earlier about where the innovation is happening in the cloud, where he said that apart from virtualization, there's no real innovation here. I'm actually going to argue that virtualization, mere virtualization, is actually an impediment to achieving what the cloud ought to be delivering. That the existence of virtualization is making it too easy for too many people to say, oh, okay, all I need to do is encapsulate what I do now in a bubble called a virtual thing and get my hardware utilization up from maybe 15% to 80%, and now I'm doing cloud computing. And my argument is that that is precisely not the best way to go. That is an evolutionary approach, and sometimes an appropriate dose of revolution is required. The model that we support, and support exclusively, this is the only thing we do, is to build a general purpose environment that handles issues like data retrieval, maintenance of a trust model, interaction with other resources through well-behaved gateways. All of these things are things that everybody wants done as well as they can possibly be done. Nobody wants to buy second-rate security. I say it's kind of like the Lufthansa model. You may have a coach seat, you may have a first-class seat, but either way, the pilot is a trained professional, and the plane lands with the wheels on the bottom and the people on the top. And this doesn't matter, how much you paid for your seat. Certain things are as good as they ought to be. And that's kind of how we feel about what this multi-tenant environment ought to be, where the only thing you have to worry about is as many of those yellow dots as you choose to operate, which represent your differentiated value-creating activities, again, to steal a phrase from Amazon, where that bubble is not merely data, but can also include very rich customization of the behavior of the system, ability to deliver to various devices, and so on. It's incredibly important to understand that the homogeneity of the consumer web is not necessarily a homogeneity of the enterprise cloud. Enterprise cloud services can be, must be, architected for deep, powerful customizability, or else they're not really interesting to anything larger than the smallest businesses. And so I'm going to offer you a definition of the cloud for which I apologize. I'm loath to bring forward another one, but I like this one, it's my own, because it does not use any statements at all about the technology. It speaks only about why should you care? Why should the label of cloud computing mean something to you more than just mere outsourcing? This is built on a whimsical rule among hackers called the 0-1 infinity rule, which is that in any properly architected system, there should never be any other number exposed to the user than 0, because any of something is bad. 1, because you want exactly 1 of something and not more that could be inconsistent or contradictory with each other. Or an unlimited number, because if there's no good reason for it to be unique or absent, then you want as many of them as you need, with no arbitrary limits. And I've applied this framework to what I think a statement that something is a cloud offering should be able to satisfy. Number one, you should be moving at least asymptotically toward the notion of zero on-premise infrastructure. Capital budgeting not being part of the IT provisioning process, because capital budgeting delays your response to new markets, forces you to lock in capacity that you may not need a month from now in order to seize an opportunity that you have today. Capital is not well aligned with the needs of IT in the modern environment. One coherent environment. That doesn't mean there's only one thing happening. Every time you load an Amazon web page, 300 services get kicked off, but to you, it's a web page. If you hit reload, it reloads, just as if it were a web page, no matter how much is happening in the back. And if you go in tomorrow, it probably works at least as well as it did yesterday, and very likely better. At no point did you need to say, maybe I'll upgrade my Amazon experience. Gee, do we have budget for that? No, you don't do that. That's not the way services work. You plug in, it works. And anything that doesn't have that characteristic, I believe, should not be using the cloud computing label. And then finally, unlimited. Unlimited scalability, that's already been discussed. Not so much stressed, but I will be stressing it in some detail, is the notion of integratability and interoperability with other assets and other services. And finally, unlimited, or as nearly as possible, unlimited customizability and programmability. Not merely the opportunity to define your own data model and your own look and feel, but to define custom logic, custom workflows. I have one customer who said the other day he has, I cannot remember if the number was 350 or 390, but it was over 300 workflows built in our environment, which he said every one of them represents the equivalent of a mission-critical application, often with millions of dollars of associated revenue. And so when people say, well, when will the cloud be relied upon for mission-critical applications, I can show you existence proofs today. This is a concept that's already been discussed in some detail with different graphics by Amazon, so I'll move along. This is just a kind of layout of what we think are the kind of high-level building blocks that ought to be delivered above the infrastructure layer of the cloud. Things like security being something you get. Now, that has been properly elevated as a critical issue. We believe that the security of the cloud today is, to use a phrase that I heard from someone at IBM, a solved problem, which makes information security arguably a more solvable problem than it ever has been before. Let me give you an example of this. In a conventional environment, data gets mailed out as attachments. A spreadsheet gets circulated to a number of people who need to see it. And once it's out there, it's out there. It stays out on the edge of the network. It's ready to be lost on a laptop. It's ready to have different people make inconsistent changes with it, and you have a problem. You need to sign off a Sarbanes-Oxley or various other European equivalents of that compliance statement about the auditability and certifiability of your processes. I don't know how you do that when your data's out roaming around with a mind of its own, or with users manipulating it in ways that you can't control. In our environment, if you decide that you want an object, which might be a single data field or maybe a composite collection of fields, to be auditable, you check a box. And at that point, every time it's changed, that's logged. Which user changed it is logged. When it was changed is logged. You don't have to worry about providing a change detection mechanism, a data structure to capture that history, a user interface to browse that history. That's all baked in. That's a platform level of abstraction that you can get when every interaction is a well-behaved, well-defined service invocation instead of being a poorly behaved, poorly defined, low-level binary interaction down in the technology layer. And this would merely be a science project if I couldn't show you that it matters, if it makes economic advantage for businesses. We now have not one, not two, but three, and in fact there's a fourth, there's an IDC study that's not on this chart. We have 4 separate studies that have been done over the 2 or 3 years that we've been offering this platform model, which all agree within 1 decimal place, which is an amazing event right there, that you will get on the order of 5-fold improvement in developer productivity by building in an environment where you don't have to do the things that we've heard previous speakers discuss as barriers to the development process. You don't have to worry about provisioning infrastructure. You don't have to worry about compatibility of different pieces of stuff along the middleware stack. You don't spend a lot of time reinventing wheels, implementing mechanisms like workflow or change detection or other things. You simply bring these in as platform functions. And so we have, as I say, now 4 separate studies that have looked at teams that have done Java development and Force.com platform development, .NET development, and Force.com development, and all agree somewhere between 4.9 and 5.1 times acceleration of developer effort. And I think that's compelling. Now, the integration argument is incredibly important because one of the things you will hear is that the cloud's immature because it's not sufficiently standardized yet, and there are too many proprietary separate clouds. And I'm saying, you know, let's take back a slightly wider view here. My feeling is that right now, we have one cloud. It's a global public network with non-proprietary protocols that allow Amazon services to interoperate with Facebook services, Google services, Force.com services, and crucially, to interoperate with all the investments that have already been made. It would be ludicrous for me to go to a business and say, I've got a solution for you, there's only one little problem, it's completely isolated from everything you've already built. I'm sorry, that conversation's over before it begins. And so it's always been axiomatic for us that we have to have strong stories for connection with your SAP and Oracle motherships, connection with the dark matter of your universe, which is out there in spreadsheets and word processing documents and PowerPoint decks. And this is another really important point. There are dozens of companies that have been addressing IT heterogeneity as their only business for years. People like Pervasive and Informatica and Cast Iron, which is a newer player in this business, they've already been dealing with the fact that real enterprise IT is not a monolith in terms of vendors. In fact, even if it is, even if all of your stuff bleeds green and comes from Redmond, it still represents different technologies from different teams on different release cycles. Try to buy unified communications from a company that has its servers on one release cycle, its clients on another release cycle, and its tools on a different cycle. The product, as a product, doesn't exist. And so we've been dealing with that kind of thing in IT for a long time, and now this is just a matter of moving to one more leaf on the tree. It's certainly not a whole new forest, and it's really not even a new separate tree. It's just one more branch of mixtures of resources that complement each other. And so that's why that integration partner ecosystem is so important. Security is incredibly important, and so we invest incredible amounts of money in it. And the result is that people like Craig Balding, who prefers not to have his company mentioned, but he's the CSO at a Fortune 500 firm, says, you know what? The cloud is not my problem. My cloud resources are the ones that I don't worry about the security on. I worry about the security of the systems that I have to maintain myself and that my users can mess up. 55% of the attendees at the London Chief Security Officers Summit a year ago said they felt that their cloud security issues were far more under control than their other security issues. And that's why this is being used now in such an extraordinary variety of tools. It's being used to build pizza management systems and medical office staffing systems and chemical sample delivery systems. This is being used to build very vertical solutions in very specialized industries. A few examples. Phoenix companies needed a CRM system and discovered that apart from spending 75% less than they originally thought they would, they also wound up with 33% improvement in sales and the ability to customize the platform to create new capability that leveraged existing data and eliminated the kind of silo problems that they had had before. Healthcare, which people often say, well, you won't do healthcare in the cloud, too sensitive, too fragmented. Fortunately, CRC Health didn't believe that, and they built systems that did, in fact, achieve compliance with various US regulatory regimen and managed to take two merged healthcare provision operations and give them a single unified IT architecture in far less time than would otherwise have been required. Professional services, I like this one because a company that originally produced litigation graphics, I'll bet you've never heard that phrase before, but that's actually a product category, realized that they could take their skill set, add connections to things like LinkedIn, which lawyers love. All the lawyers are on LinkedIn and know who's working on what. And things like Google News, you can bring in news stories on a case that might be unfolding, a high-profile class action suit, for example. Come up with a productized service called Law Prospector and bring that to market with no capital investment and no new development staff. This opened up an opportunity to turn skills they already had into a whole new class of go-to-market tactic. And Vitrazo, which makes recycled glass kitchen counters wanted to be able to open new manufacturing and showroom facilities without having to parachute in an IT guy to set up a server in every one of them. So they built their complete end-to-end ERP system from raw material ordering all the way through post-installation warranty support as a cloud application, which is now callable through a web browser from any of their offices the day that they open up. They're immediately part of the headquarters mothership IT. And that's been an enormous advantage for them to be able to expand into new markets. Why is this so important? In the first 25 years of the PC, everybody knew that Moore's Law was giving us, and I'm going to put that in quotes, faster machines. In fact, processors got faster 30% per year, which is an amazing rate. Problem is memory went up by 50% per year. Mass storage went up 80% per year. And so the client-server model quickly became very ungovernable. You had just too much stuff, too poorly organized, being managed by individual users who weren't trained to be system administrators, certainly weren't database architects, and you just wound up with, I believe the phrase has already been used today, a dog's breakfast. Desktop systems just had too much state. And meanwhile, in the background, bandwidth was growing faster than CPU speed. So if someone said, well, you can't do that over a wire, it won't be responsive enough. That's become at least 10% less true every year for the last 2.5 decades. Moore never actually said that computers would get faster. He said that transistors would get smaller and cheaper. For the first few generations of microprocessor, that did translate to meaningful speed improvement. Now it's just translating to multi-core processors. The newest Xeon is a 6-core chip. A Sun Niagara is an 8-core chip. That does not get one person's job done 6 or 8 times as quickly. But it does mean that the massive shared data center capacity of a Google or an Amazon or a Salesforce.com is going to be delivering units of work at a lower capital expenditure per unit in a way that's going to just enormously widen the gap of cost effectiveness between cloud solutions and local solutions. And things like photo editing, that used to be what Intel relied on to sell people a faster PC every few years, are now in fact being offered as cloud services by people like Adobe and Google with the Picasa service. And here's an interesting thing. If you follow the money to the shared data center and you follow the user excitement to the social network, you wind up with data centralization and governability, which have always been very difficult to achieve, happening almost as a side effect. All of a sudden now the logical thing to do is have one document up in Google Space which multiple people can collaborate on and edit, and change tracking becomes very straightforward instead of building an enormous middleware layer to try to achieve synchronization and replication and change negotiation among all these separate copies, which are the legacy of the client-server model. This is why I say it's a mistake to use the word evolution too often. Sometimes an appropriate jolt of revolution is what's needed. How does this affect applications? Well, if all you do is automate your existing sales support process, you haven't really taken advantage of the cloud. If you realize that all of your salespeople are now interacting on a shared network, you can introduce something like our Genius facility, which allows salespeople to find other people who've been in similar deal situations, maybe similar industry, similar deal size, similar competitors involved, and quickly share their tips on what works. It's not merely moving to the cloud, what we've done before. It's saying, given that we're in a cloud, how should we approach this task? In the service and support area, it used to be your internal knowledge base of your product was the world's platinum standard of how to use your product. But now your customers, in any given area, there's probably at least one customer that knows more than you do about how your own product behaves because they've been exploring those edge and corner cases. And they're out there talking to each other on Google and Twitter and Facebook. And so we believe that the service and support function now needs to draw in and include all of those important conversations instead of pretending that they don't matter because they're outside your walls. We believe that for application developers, things like the ability to deploy the same function to an iPhone or a desktop or a laptop or a speech synthesizer in your car ought to be something that the platform does for you, instead of developers needing to write the same application 4 or 5 times. We think that's what a cloud platform should be. Now, people say, are you saying that everything will move to the cloud? Nothing ever goes away. First mainframe built in the 50s, and yet we still have Nobel Prize-winning physicists at IBM developing new, faster, cheaper mainframes. Why? Because it's economically relevant. But does it change anyone's concept of what a mainframe does? At this point, probably not. Same thing with minis. They were revolutionary when they were first introduced, and people said, wow, you're really democratizing IT. You're taking it out of the glass house. Yeah, okay, but we did that. Then we brought out PCs. When was the last time something that you saw on a PC changed your definition of what a PC was good for? It hasn't happened in a long time, except about 2 years ago, when all of a sudden my kids stopped seeing a PC as primarily a device for doing word processing and saw it primarily as a device for running Facebook. And now instead of using email, which they regard as so last decade, they do almost all their interaction over live links on Facebook chat. I saw my son on Facebook one night and I said, "Didn't you have homework to do?" He said, "Dad, we're doing homework." They don't meet at the bookstore anymore. They don't meet at someone's house. They all get up on Facebook and have a collaboration session right there. That's the way they do this stuff. And so here's the new top row of that chart. Cloud applications and platforms are where people are redefining how they want to acquire and to use capability. It does not replace what's come before, but it adds value to everything you've already done and makes it possible to take existing resources of data, business logic, customer and partner ecosystems, and liberate economic value from them that was never accessible to you before. Finally, it puts IT spending back in balance, because instead of that horrible stair-step diagram we saw before, now you build the system, satisfy yourself that it solves a problem, test it on a user population, and only when you're satisfied that it's ready to go do you say, "Fine, I want 100,000 people to be able to use this tomorrow morning," and you can have that. And so in an economic downturn like the one we have now, as people like Jack Welch, and for that matter, the folks at Cisco have reminded us many times, downturns are when you invest, because that's when you gain share that you will keep on the uptrend of the cycle. That's the end of my material on the technology side, but I am mindful of the fact that we want to talk about the human implications of this, so I'm going to add something that I hadn't originally planned to make part of my remarks. Irving was talking about the difficulty of labeling what comes after the Industrial Revolution, whether you call it the Knowledge Revolution or whatever. Norbert Wiener didn't bother. He just said, "We'll call this the Second Industrial Revolution." And he commented that just as there is no wage rate at which a man with a pick and shovel can live while competing with a steam shovel or a bulldozer, so will there someday be no wage rate at which the average human being can compete against the reproducible processing and accuracy of an electronic computer. And so, and this is the phrase that really stuck in my mind, taking this second industrial revolution as accomplished, the average human being of mediocre attainments has nothing to sell that is worth anyone's money to buy. That is a terrifying implication of what we are doing here, that the average human being simply has nothing to offer that the market finds economically appealing. And that Norbert Wiener was able to visualize this in 1948 strikes me as one of the most remarkable pieces of understanding the social impact of technology change that's ever been put on paper. Thank you.
Great.